All right, welcome everyone to our event today, how to choose between a co-op or a nonprofit for your radical real estate project.
Entonces, bienvenidos a todos a nuestro evento de hoy para cómo decidir entre una cooperativa y un proyecto para decidir entre una cooperativa y una organización sin fines de lucro para tu proyecto de bienes raíces.
This is part of a month-long Tenants Without Landlords fundraising campaign.
Y ese tema de hoy es parte de nuestro mes de inquilinos sin arrendadores y nuestra campaña de recaudar fondos.
We're trying to raise $25,000, and with the hopes that when we meet that goal, 10% will go to Wood Street Commons.
Y estamos intentando recaudar $25,000 y 10% de ese dinero vamos a otorgar a Wood Street Commons.
And I'm dropping the link to our fundraiser in the chat.
Y voy a poner el enlace a nuestra recaudación de fondos en el chat.
Thank you. And now I'm going to pass it to Joshua Stallings, who will explain the interpretation for today's event.
Y yo voy a pasarlo a Joshua Stallings para hacer la introducción de interpretación por nuestro evento de hoy. So I'll go ahead and share this first in Spanish and then repeat in English. Como dijeron, mi nombre es Joshua. Voy a ser su intérprete hoy con la Cooperativa Comunitaria del Lenguaje y quiero agradecerles por su compromiso con la justicia del
I'm gonna put my
lenguaje.
headphones in a second.
Lo cual significa que todas las personas aquí tienen el derecho de comunicar en el idioma de su corazón. Entonces, una vez que termine de hablar, vamos a activar la función de interpretación. Y si no ha usado esta función antes, si estás en computadora, va a aparecer un icono de globo terráqueo en la barra de navegación al parte inferior de su pantalla. Se puede elegir este icono y luego seleccionar su idioma de preferencia. Y si está en una aplicación de Zoom de una tableta o teléfono, se puede elegir los 3 puntitos, seleccionar interpretación y luego idioma de preferencia. Si usted no está hablando, por favor, manténgase en mudo. Y si usted es bilingüe, no es necesario elegir un idioma. Y por favor, recuerde hablar a un ritmo de conversación para que yo pueda brindar una interpretación precisa del mensaje. Y si hay cualquier error con la función de interpretación, avísenos de inmediato, por favor. Y solo voy a estar interpretando lo que estamos diciendo verbalmente y no lo que está en el chat, solo para avisarles. Muchas gracias. So real quick in English, my name is Josh. I'll be interpreting for you today with the Community Language Cooperative. I want to thank you all for your commitment to language justice, meaning that all people in this space have the right to communicate in the language of their heart. I'll be interpreting simultaneously between English and Spanish. And just a reminder for you all to keep yourselves on mute. And for our speakers to remember to speak at a conversational pace so that both me and our ASL interpreter can provide an accurate interpretation of the message. We'll be interpreting the verbal language, not what is put in the chat. And so once I finish talking, we'll turn on the interpretation feature. If you're on a computer, there will be a globe icon that appears at the bottom of your screen, which you can select to then choose your language. And if you are on a Zoom application on a phone or tablet, you'll select the 3 dots, select interpretation, and then your preferred language. If you're bilingual, it's not necessary to choose a language. And if there's any issues with the interpretation feature during the meeting, please let us know right away so that we can address that. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to start the feature now. And I'm going to, once again, thank you all so much for joining us. I actually forgot to introduce myself. My name is Mwende Inahosa, and I'm the Director of Communications and Strategic Storytelling here at the Law Center. Before I pass it on to the people who you're really here for, my colleagues who are going to teach you all about how to choose between a co-op or a nonprofit for your radical real estate project, I wanted to thank our sponsors. Without our sponsors, events like this couldn't happen. So we're really grateful to the folks that you see here on our slide. And just another quick reminder that this is part of a month-long fundraising campaign. So I'll be dropping the link if you want to drop some coins in our bucket to help keep events like this going. So now I'm going to pass to my colleague, Erica. Let me spotlight you here. There you go. Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, so these are our speakers today, and we'll just introduce ourselves. I'm Erica. I'm an attorney at the Law Center and Equal Justice Works Fellow, sponsored by Baker McKenzie and Salesforce. And my work at the Law Center centers around our mutual aid work and our land stewardship work. So I work with a lot of nonprofit clients who own land and are doing cool projects. And I'll hand it over to Jay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jay Cumberland. I work with Erica at the Sustainable Economies Law Center. My work focuses on converting businesses to worker cooperatives and converting existing housing to housing cooperatives. And I will pass it to Carl.
Hi, nice to see everyone. I'm Carl Mill. I'm an attorney at Mill Law Center. We're an 8-person law firm that works with nonprofits. Big fan of Sustainable Economies Law Center and people using nonprofits in creative ways. So I'm looking forward to this.
Great. So today we're going to start with a framing and some basic information about entities, and then we'll dive into the major differences between nonprofits and for-profit cooperatives. And then Carl will share a little bit about charitable purpose and class and conflicts of interest. And I'll talk about funding, taxes, and a few other considerations. And then Jay and I will each share a couple of examples from our own clients, and we'll end with a little bit of time for Q&A. Great. So who is this presentation for? We're imagining that you're mostly groups or lawyers of these groups looking to own land collectively, use horizontal decision-making structures, and generally support yourselves and your communities. These are the kinds of groups that conceivably might fit into more of a 501c3 model or a cooperative model. And we'll focus mainly today on the ways that these two general models differ from each other. But there are also a lot of similarities between these groups. And that's regardless of their entity choice. And so in particular, I think the work of getting together with a group of other people, building relationships and trust, and coming up with a shared vision rooted in shared values is the most important and difficult part of starting a project like this. So we feel really strongly that you're already doing the hardest part, and your choice of entity doesn't define the kind of organization you are or whether you're going to be extractive and harmful or good. So instead, we just like to think of entities as tools that come with certain sets of advantages and disadvantages, and you just need to figure out what works best for your group. So this presentation will be a place to get started, but it's probably not going to get you all the way to where you need to be because there's so many different options for how to create an entity structure, but hopefully it'll aid you in understanding your options, fleshing out your vision, and ultimately bringing you closer together and closer to your goals. So to get on the same page about what these things are and how they work together, we like to use this cake metaphor. You can think of the sponge of the cake as the entity and the icing as the tax status, and you can mix and match them. And then there's an infinite possibility as well for the ingredients that you choose to make up both your cake and your icing. And that's in your internal financial governance and operational structure. And these things also show up in your policies, practices, and bylaws. The sponge or the entity is something that you form according to state law and could include an LLC, a nonprofit corporation, an unincorporated association, or a variety of other kinds of entities.
No.
Did someone say something? Okay. If you're a group of people doing something together, you automatically become an unincorporated association under state law. So if you want to incorporate as a formal entity, you'll need to register with the Secretary of State. And then the icing or the tax status is something that you can elect at the federal level, usually to achieve a particular tax benefit. And this could include one of the 501Cs or a variety of non-exempt options as well. There are some tax statuses that you can just claim, and then there are others like a charitable 501c3 that you have to submit an application for. So your default cake is generally an unincorporated association. Why would you want to incorporate from there? Well, a lot of people want the liability shield that comes with a formal entity. So if you're following the proper rules on corporate formalities, treating the entity as its own and keeping things separate, then it will provide the owners and the workers with a shield from liability for activities that you do under the entity. This can protect your personal assets like your home and your car in case your business gets sued. There are also some less comprehensive protections for unincorporated groups working together depending on the state. So in California, members of unincorporated associations have protection from liability for contracts, but not for other kinds of liability. So it's not essential to incorporate, but if you're going to be purchasing land, owning real estate does come with some significant risks. For example, if someone comes to your land and falls and gets hurt, they might sue you. So incorporation is one way to help manage those risks, along with other things like insurance and liability waivers. So in general, there are three basic categories of entities that you can form in most states. Public benefit, which includes regular nonprofit corporations, mutual benefit, which includes cooperative corporations and nonprofit mutual benefit corporations, and then for-profit or shareholder-owned, which includes regular corporations, but also things like cooperatives formed as LLCs and social benefit corporations or B Corps. But again, the image in the last slide wasn't really a complete picture. Some models use multiple entities of different types working together to create a hybrid model. And it's also very important what ingredients you put into your entities, and that's again in your policies and practices. So regardless of the entity type, you have a lot of control over how you want to make decisions and build your governance structure. And this is a topic that the Law Center works on a lot and has a lot of resources on, so I'll keep it brief here. But we at the Law Center like to call ourselves a worker self-directed nonprofit, which is like the cake on the left, a nonprofit corporation, but with lots of cooperative principles mixed in. Now let's talk about tax status, which is the icing in our metaphor here. For nonprofit corporations, they can operate as tax-paying corporations, or they can seek exemption under Section 501c3 or another section of the tax code. For-profit and mutual benefit organizations similarly have a number of choices. They can't necessarily get tax exemption, but they can elect from a variety of options as to how their taxes will actually be assessed and calculated. And this is, again, a little complicated, so I won't get super deep in the weeds, but just know that you can mix and match to find a cake that overall works for you. And then finally, I want to highlight a way that organizations that don't have tax exemption for themselves can essentially kind of borrow it from another organization through fiscal sponsorship. So 501c3 nonprofits can fiscally sponsor other nonprofits that don't have tax exemption, and they can also fiscally sponsor for-profit organizations by receiving and channeling grants and donations. And they just have to make sure that ultimately these funds are going to be used for charitable or educational or other exempt purposes. And this is a great way for new nonprofit organizations to get started and not have to deal with all of the administrative work, or also for cooperatives to get access to grants and tax exempt donations. But a major drawback to being a fiscally sponsored project is that it does take away some of your freedom to do whatever you want, because the sponsoring organization has oversight obligations. So it's important that the fiscal sponsor and sponsee have a good relationship, be on the same page about what they're doing together, and have a clear agreement with mutual rights and responsibilities laid out, as well as how to terminate the relationship if needed. So now I'll hand it over to Carl to talk a little bit about charitable purpose.
Thanks, Erica. That was great. And when I'm talking about charitable purpose in the next couple slides, you can think of this as sort of the, if you choose the 501c3 icing, what comes with that? Because that icing comes with the most perks. And by virtue of coming with the most perks, it comes with the most limitations. And when I'm talking about these things, note that they apply both to your housing project if it wants to acquire 501c3 status, and also if it's fiscally sponsored, because like Erica said, part of the catch of being fiscally sponsored is giving the sponsor control, but it is also that you sign up for all the restrictions that a 501c3 has by doing it. So in terms of what's in the grant agreement. So let's think about what is a charitable purpose, and specifically what is a charitable purpose in the context of housing. Charitable purpose is listed in 501c3. There's things that are charitable, educational, religious, scientific, some other random stuff we don't need to talk about. Let's start with educational, because it's kind of an easy one. Education is instructing the public about things or in training individual skills. That's useful if your housing project is teaching people about housing, how to form your own co-op, how to do things. That's really not going to be helpful for setting up an organization providing housing, though, right? So, often when we're talking about housing, we're in the charitable column. We're in the things that are charitable, and there's sort of what I call classic charity, dictionary definition charity, and that's providing relief to the poor, providing relief to the needy and distressed. And as the IRS has sort of interpreted this, that's sort of the low income model, 80% AMI and below. There's a revenue procedure that guides that can guide you on what constitutes. I'm gonna go back to the last slide for just one more second. That can guide you on who is in what category in terms of what is needed to be a housing organization that provides relief to needy and distressed. That is just one kind of charitable purpose, though, and that is the one you might follow if you're looking at low-income housing tax credit work or following the revenue procedure I mentioned, 9632, that provides really specific guidelines of how many people at this level can be in the housing, that sort of thing. If you want to get more creative, you might look at other kinds of charitable purposes, such as combating community deterioration. There are examples where in a context of a particular community, the housing project was, even if it wasn't necessarily as targeted to the needy and distressed, it could be charitable because of the needs of the community in combating deterioration. Lessening the burdens of government. So sometimes the one way to have more flexibility on your housing project is to be doing it in collaboration with a local or state or federal government. Eliminating discrimination and prejudice. So correcting prior racial injustice in the context of housing in a community can be one way to get there, to get to a charitable purpose in your housing project. Lessening neighborhood tensions is in there. I'm always, some of these are just sort of words that are listed in the regulations, and you're probably going to try to cite to all of them, if you're coming up with a creative housing project. Because typically the tension here is you're doing a creative housing project. Yes, there's a way to do it following these strictly sort of low income guidelines, but often some of the people I talk to want to, how can we serve the people that get left out of that? And that can be, these are some ways to get there. Lessening neighborhood tensions, and then providing relief to the elderly or disabled can be one way, and needing housing that meets their specific needs. So they're all charitable purposes, and there's many others. There's environmental purposes, there's securing rights under law. So if you're representing tenants, that can be a kind of charitable housing activity. So these are all purposes. And when I'm talking about purposes, in the next slide we're going to get to, this is what I think of as the affirmative test. The affirmative part of being a 501c3 is you have to do the right stuff. And sometimes when you're making this decision about, do I want to be a 501c3 or not, I kind of remind people, like Erica said, regardless of what vehicle you choose, there's lots of ways to do good. So imagine like a big circle. These are all the things that are good things you can do. Well, all these things that are good things, the things that are 501c3 are actually a smaller circle within that circle, right? It is only things that are charitable, educational, scientific, religious, etc. So we're trying to fit into one of those buckets. And when we think about this, we also have this term charitable class come up. So there sort of is the purpose charitable, and then there is who is being served by it. Are we serving a charitable class? And what I would do is I break that into two parts. So when we say charitable class, there's one sense in which we need to make sure that people we're serving are connected with our charitable purpose. So for example, you might assume that anyone impacted by sort of climate change related disasters, providing relief to those people rebuilding their housing is a charitable activity. Or that's not quite true. There's guidance that says that in the context of providing relief to people who've been harmed, you still need to focus on who is needy and distressed. So if someone who after the disaster does not have the financial means to rebuild, you as a 501c3 can assist them. If Warren Buffett's home is destroyed in a tornado, that is unfortunate, and the 501c3 can provide some immediate relief in the aftermath of the disaster, but they're not part of a charitable class. He's not part of someone who can be served by this. So it's sort of exclusive in that way. And it's not always just who is needy or distressed. Like I said, sometimes the elderly can constitute a charitable class. Sometimes people can constitute a charitable class if they're for other reasons as well. But it needs to be charitable in that sense. So there's ultimately who is in the class is related to a charitable purpose. The other way charitable class comes up is that it needs to be broad and indefinite. So let's say 10 people get together, want to form a housing co-op, and the purpose of the nonprofit is to provide housing to those 10 people and to their families. So let's assume even if they're all what we call needy distressed, is the tax word for being in need, that wouldn't be a charitable class. Why? Well, because they're pre-designated people. A charitable class needs to be indefinite and broad. So sometimes when you're thinking about this sort of these housing projects, you have to think about who it is you're serving. Who is our class? Do we have a reason to say that this class is in a part of a charitable class, that we're serving either the needy and distressed or other charitable purposes? And we have to make sure that it's not just for the 10 people who set it up. So that is why, like I said, when you get the benefits of 501c3, it comes with the trade-offs that you can't operate for the benefit of particular people. I think I'll use that. So that's kind of the affirmative part of it. What is charitable? What are the things you need to use your 501c3 for? And let's get to the negative test part of it, which is the conflicts part. So these are the things that if you want to be a 501c3, you can't do. And I'm going to break this into 3 separate categories, all of which come up in the context of housing: private inurement, private benefit, and what I'll just call intermediate sanctions. Let's start with intermediate sanctions because it's boring and easy, hopefully, to follow. Intermediate sanctions refers to the idea that any 501c3, when it engages in a transaction with a related party, director, officer, person with substantial influence, their family members, can only engage in terms with them on fair market value. So you can't have a nonprofit that has a transaction with an insider where the insider is getting better than fair terms. So it's either being overpaid by the nonprofit or paying the nonprofit less than it should. It's not an obvious exception here for being part of a charitable class. So one thing I call out for people is if you're going to have that relationship, it's really, you have to sort of monitor each individual transaction and make sure that the for-profit or the co-op or the C4 or the whatever, the individual person is not getting a more than fair market value deal. Let's talk about the other 2 things because they're really relevant to a lot of the housing ideas people have. And it'll connect to the inurement, will connect to the charitable class part. So private inurement is one of those old-fashioned words that refers to the idea that 501c3s cannot provide benefits to their members, their insiders, that are akin to the way a for-profit provides benefits to its shareholders. It's a nonprofit. It needs to not, profits can't inure to the people who set it up and run it. So you can see how that kind of ties to the charitable class issue. It can also tie to the idea of the sort of cooperative structures, things that nonprofits can do. Nonprofits can absolutely be cooperatively governed, cooperatively structured. The people who appoint your board or serve on your board can be defined however you want to define them in whatever creative way to define them. What you can't do is take the profits of a 501c3 and split them up among the people who formed it or who lead it. That makes it not a 501c3, disqualifying. The other test I mentioned, the other negative test, is the private benefit test. That says that a 501c3 cannot provide excessive private benefit or benefit that is more than incidental to achieving its charitable purpose. So this is really important when you have affiliate structures, and sometimes I describe it this way, which is when you think about what is the purpose of the nonprofit from a big picture perspective, does it look like it has a purpose of benefiting a particular person, a particular entity, a particular organization other than a 501c3 organization? Or is that entity only sort of benefiting as part of the charitable purpose? So, for example, a good, old kind of controversial case that came up going on 30 years ago called Housing Pioneers. And it was actually sort of a pretty classic, if you're familiar with the affordable housing industry, pretty classic structure, a nonprofit that was more or less captive to a for-profit developer. And they said, oh, we're just following the rules. And the IRS actually said, you know what, the way you are doing this, the particular way you are this nonprofit in bed with a particular developer, yes, you may be doing a charitable activity, but you have a substantial purpose of benefiting your for-profit developer. You're not doing the things you're supposed to be doing in terms of operating independently and those sort of things. So that was actually disqualifying for exempt purposes. You know, you might say, and I would say, that there are many examples out there of affiliate relationships where it sure seems like there's a for-profit running side by side, or a cooperative, or a different kind of tax exempt entity that's getting positive benefits. And the question is that can be okay as long as those benefits are incidental. They're not the point of what the charity is doing, they're a byproduct. How does that define? It's really subjective, of course. One thing that's really important is if you have a structure like this, an affiliate structure, my recommendation is always to put careful thought into your tax exemption application. That is your chance to tell the IRS what you're doing, what your relationship is, and why you think any of those benefits are merely incidental, because you're really just focused on your charitable activities. If you do that and the IRS approves, then you're going forward, you have a plan of operation. If you don't do that, if you give something vague to the IRS, or if you start doing this halfway through your activities, then you just kind of have to make the calls yourself and manage the risk yourself. And you know, so those are the rules that come with 501c3 status. I think there's lots of good creative ways to do housing projects within those rules. And I think in some cases, those rules provide positive guideposts to do things like make sure your benefit is going where it's intended to be, instead of being captured by particular individuals or companies. Though I know that sometimes they might feel frustrating as well. And I think with that, I will kick it over to the next slide, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you, Carl. That was really helpful description of the rules and how to navigate them a little bit. And for sure, all of it's a little messy, and it kind of depends on, you know, how much risk you're willing to take on. So let's talk now about some of the different funding sources that your organizations might be looking at. So where you envision getting the bulk of your funds could have a significant impact on your choice of entity. So we'll just go through each of these sources one by one. So on the nonprofit side, if you want access to grants, you'll generally want to be either a nonprofit or enter into a fiscal sponsorship, which we talked about earlier, is a way to get some of the benefits of tax exemption, but requires partnering with an existing nonprofit. Private foundations and other nonprofits can give directly to for-profit cooperative organizations, but they're often not willing to do so. And that's just because private foundations have expenditure responsibility requirements. So they have extra monitoring requirements, which is a disincentive when they give to for-profits, and generally they're more risk averse. Tax deductible donations is another one. Any organization can receive donations, but if you care that the donation will give the donor a deduction on their income taxes, then you have to be a 501c3 or have a fiscal sponsor. That said, only around the wealthiest 10% or so of Americans actually itemize their deductions. The rest of us just take the standard deduction. So this factor might not be as important as people think it is. Staff educational debt forgiveness, like the public service loan forgiveness, is another benefit only available to 501c3s and a few other kinds of nonprofits. In the middle, we have donations that are not tax deductible. Earned income. Any organization can also earn income from their activities, including nonprofits. So they don't have to get all of their money from grants. We at the Law Center sometimes charge fees for legal services, teaching workshops, and other consulting activities, and that's fine. And then public offerings of debt using securities exemption. So nonprofits can only get access to debt, while cooperatives can get access to both equity and debt. And the reason for that is, as Carl was saying, if you have equity, then you're going to be an owner of the entity, and nonprofits aren't allowed to be owned by anyone. So on the for-profit side, we have public offerings of equity using securities exemptions, and as well as institutional loans from banks and traditional financial institutions. Generally, these kinds of organizations will only give you loans if there's an equity cushion. So in other words, if your organization's not doing so hot and the value goes down, then the owners will take a hit, but the lenders will still get paid. So because they can't have equity, nonprofits can't really get these types of loans. And then I'll just say a little bit more about raising money from the public using securities exemptions. So if you're interested in raising money through offering debt or equity to the public, you should definitely look at the securities regulation laws in your state. Registration requirements are really burdensome, so you'll probably want to look for an exemption from those requirements. And many states do have securities registration exemptions for cooperatives, allowing them to take capital from members of the general public. This is true in California for shares of up to $1,000 per person. Many more states have securities exemptions for nonprofits, but that's only for debt. So you might be able to raise capital more freely if you choose a nonprofit structure, but only for debt. Okay, now we'll talk about taxes and what it means to be tax exempt. So most people probably know that tax exempt nonprofit organizations don't have to pay income taxes, and that's a major benefit of that form of entity. On the other hand, cooperatives do have to pay income taxes, and there's no getting around that. I think a lot of groups hear tax exemption though, and they think we definitely need that. That's so important, but it's not necessarily as important as you think, and it does add to the administrative burden of running the organization. So remember that organizations are only taxed on their profits. So if you have a lot of expenses that pretty much meet your revenue, then you might not have very much profit at all. And expenses can also be adjusted to match your income using a budget. So if you have more revenue, you can pay your employees a higher salary, and that'll be subtracted from your income as an expense. On the other hand, if you're using that money to buy land, then that would not be considered an expense and would be part of your profit. So whether tax exemption is worth it for you really just depends on your organizational structure and your needs. But also, if you're not a tax exempt organization, there are a lot of other ways to minimize the burden of your taxes. So we discussed earlier how cooperatives can get access to grant funding and tax deductible donations through fiscal sponsorship. Well, fiscal sponsorship can also help you control the timing of when that income comes in to reduce your overall tax burden. It's really important because obviously profits are calculated each year as revenue minus expenses. So if you have a fixed set of expenses each year and you get a big grant coming in one year, your fiscal sponsor can help you spread that out when you actually receive that income over the next couple of years so that your income matches your expenses and there's not as much profit left over. So I'm not going to go through the example on the slide, but it's here if you want to look it over, and just know that being able to control the timing of your income can make a big difference when it comes to how much tax you'll pay. Now, property tax can actually be a bigger burden sometimes than income tax for real estate holding organizations. And there are certain ways to reduce your property tax burden. One of these is donating a conservation easement or a cultural easement to a local indigenous or environmental organization. And you can do this regardless of what type of entity you choose, by committing to not develop the land permanently and preserve it for cultural and environmental purposes. That reduces the market value of the land and thereby reduces your property taxes. So that's one way to reduce your property tax burden, but the only way that's actually been tested to get full property tax exemption is to be a 501c3 and use the land for charitable or religious or other exempt purposes. Jay was doing some research before this and found that it might be possible for a limited equity housing cooperative to get welfare tax exemption in the future, but I don't think it's happened to our knowledge yet. So this is a huge plus for nonprofits, but be warned that in California, the application process is a lot of work. It's pretty stringent, and it can take a couple of years for them to process the application, do a site visit and everything, and you have to reapply each year. Our coworkers Tien Tobias did a presentation just a couple of weeks ago on how to get property tax exemption in California, so definitely check that out if you're interested. There are also some employment law considerations to choosing an entity. So in particular, it's really easy for nonprofits to have unpaid volunteers, but it's generally not okay for for-profit organizations. There are some exceptions or arguments to be made, like having unpaid interns or if the volunteers are doing charitable activities, but generally only nonprofits can have unpaid volunteers. On the other hand, if you want to work with undocumented folks, they can be owners of a business but not employees. So in that case, you'll want to choose an LLC cooperative form, and that won't really work with any other type of entity. 501c3 nonprofits also have some limitations on their lobbying. So you can't actually support specific candidates for office, but you can lobby politicians or at the grassroots level on issues that your organization cares about. And you can also do other policy work that doesn't count as lobbying. You just have to track your time and money spent on lobbying, and it can't exceed a certain percentage of your overall activities if you're a 501c3. Oops. And then I'll just mention briefly that there are a bunch of other exemptions also only available to nonprofits. For example, nonprofits in California can lend money much more easily than for-profit organizations if the loans fall into certain parameters. So depending on your specific field of activities, it could be worthwhile to look into the regulation of those activities and whether there are exemptions for nonprofits. Okay, now we're going to talk about a couple of our clients. We work with a lot of amazing groups doing amazing work, and here's a map of some of our partners and collaborators. So we're going to share a little bit about these groups. So Sawal Mem is one of our Indigenous land return clients. They're an entity held by the Winnemem Wintu tribe. We help them form a nonprofit, unincorporated association with 501c3 church status. And they chose the nonprofit form because they wanted access to grant funding, but they really opposed the regular nonprofit corporation because they wanted to avoid disruption of the tribe's traditional pre-existing decision-making structures. So using an unincorporated association allowed them to not have a board of directors and instead write into their organizing document that decisions will be made using the traditional ways of the tribe. This form had a couple of other benefits as well, like minimizing paperwork and admin, and some benefits of the church status as well, like automatic tax exemption and simplified property tax exemption applications. And then maybe most importantly, it gets around some of the California nonprofit conflict of interest rules. So in California, nonprofit corporations need at least 51% disinterested board members. But that's not a requirement for 501c3s. So the tribe wanted to run this organization with their people, sometimes pay themselves for their work. But as it turns out, they're all pretty much related to each other, which would make them all interested if any of them are getting paid. So we created a unique conflict of interest policy that meets the required outcome that Carl was talking about, where the organization's best interests be the ultimate driver of the decision, and they get at least fair market value, but it doesn't require recusal or a certain percentage of disinterested decision makers, because those procedural pieces would make it really hard for them to operate. And we attached this conflict of interest policy to their application for tax exemption, and the IRS approved it. So that was a big win, showing that we can do things a little differently and still meet these legal requirements. On the other hand, one challenge that's come up is that when the tribe wanted to buy a piece of land last year, they weren't able to work with any of the title insurance companies because the companies were confused about the entity structure. They weren't familiar with it, and so they refused to work with SAOMEM, even though there's no legal issue with the entity being able to hold land. So it's not really clear at this point if they were concerned with us not having a letter from the IRS yet, or with the unincorporated association entity. SAOMEM recently received its exemption letter, so we'll see if that changes things. But in the meantime, I guess the fact that some entity structures are more common and familiar to people in certain industries is one takeaway and thing to consider when choosing yours. Oops. Another client we work with is Shelterwood. They're a Black, Indigenous, and queer-led forest, community, and educational center working to heal our ecosystems through active stewardship. And we began working with them in their early stages of getting started as an organization. And at the time, they weren't really sure whether the nonprofit form was right for them. They had reservations in particular about the nonprofit industrial complex and whether entering that system could really be a path for liberation. But ultimately, the nonprofit form was great upfront because they were able to get much easier access to grant funding. And the collective members didn't have the capital to buy into a cooperative and purchase land together on their own. So grants made that possible. But one challenge that's arisen out of their choice relates to their individual security and investments in the project. So they don't want to invest in Wall Street and they don't want to have retirement accounts. All of the collective members live and work on the land. So they kind of want to play the role of owners and use the land as a long-term financial plan, but they're not really allowed to do that under the nonprofit structure. So they're put in a tricky situation when deciding to do things like, whether or not to pay for renovations and improvements out of pocket. But ultimately, their ability to get access to the land and employ BIPOC folks to do this work was made possible by using the nonprofit form. And now I'll hand it over to Jay again to talk about a few other clients.
Yeah, one of our other clients is the Asian Pacific Self-Development and Residential Association, abbreviated as APSARA. This is a resident association that was trying to move from having 50% control of an apartment complex to 100% control of an apartment complex. So they had the option as they moved to full control to restructure this property potentially from being a rental project to being a cooperative project. And so that's what we were looking into for them. As you look through these options that are presented and move from number one, which is staying a rental project where the resident association just gains full control, to being like a quasi rental project, quasi homeownership project through a limited equity housing cooperative, and then further to a market rate stock cooperative, you can see that the upfront cost and the ongoing cost of that increase, while the financial benefits for individuals also increase somewhat. And so in looking at these things with them, we showed them all of these different costs associated with having a certain entity type, having a certain tax status, and they made the decision that given the respective cost and benefits of all these things, they weren't comfortable absorbing those costs at this particular moment. They wanted to make the initial choice to just remain a rental project, gain full control, and work over time to put together the money to become a limited equity housing cooperative that had limited equity, that had a limited amount of share buy-in. So they decided to be, number one, just a resident controlled nonprofit project with 501c3 tax status, and then become a limited equity housing cooperative with 501c3 tax status, despite the cost. But they needed to do that over time because of how high those costs were. So that's it for that one. We'll move to the next one. Next one is the permanent real estate cooperative idea that the Sustainable Economies Law Center helped develop. This is a cooperative corporation, but it's not legally speaking, under California law, a limited equity housing cooperative, although functionally that's what it is. Structuring it this way, sort of outside of the specific confines of a legal definition, allows it to avoid a lot of the high upfront cost associated with creating a limited equity housing cooperative in California, and allows that to happen more quickly because it doesn't have to comply with regulations at the state level for that creation. But this comes with drawbacks. It comes with not having tax exempt status. So it can't, it has to pay income taxes, unlike a nonprofit. But the benefit of this is that it can serve not just low income people, the needy and distressed, like Carl was talking about, but it can also build social housing for people of all incomes. And to try to get tax deductible grants and donations, though, to help start up this model, PRECs can enter into fiscal sponsorships that allow them to access grants and tax deductible donations before they have projects that are bringing in income for them. And this can allow them, like Erica was talking about, to phase their income recognition over time to minimize their taxable income in a given year. The other drawback to this project not being a nonprofit is that it can't access the welfare tax exemption. So there's high ongoing property tax costs in California that can impact affordability. But a benefit to being a California cooperative corporation for them is that they can access the equity crowdfunding exemption that Erica was speaking about, specifically for California cooperatives. So they can issue shares up to $1,000 exempt from securities registration. Thank you. Next, back to you, Erica.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, so before we end, I just want to give a plug for our free donation-based online legal cafes. Hopefully this presentation wasn't too overwhelming, but it is a lot of information. And also you have just so many options, even within the nonprofit and cooperative categories. So given that all of this is so specific to your organization's particular needs, please come to our legal cafes so we can talk through your specific situation with you. And I think the Q&A section will hopefully focus more on some general considerations. All right. I'm noticing that we do have a bunch of questions in the chat. And I'm wondering if anyone who put something into the chat wants to come off mute and ask their question.
Well, since no one else is, I'd like to ask a question. And that is, what is your recent experience getting 501c3 status for something like a limited equity co-op or a similar structure?
I can chime in with a couple of thoughts. I mean, the short answer is this goes back to the cake icing metaphor, and probably good to underline something. Not all cakes can get every kind of icing. The 501c3 icing can only get slathered onto a nonprofit public benefit corporation. So you're getting tax exemption for a limited equity housing co-op seems to, not knowing as much about those as other people, but by definition, having equity means it is not a nonprofit. By definition means it doesn't get 501c3. What could be an option, what we do see, is affiliate structures, right? So the LEHC sets up a 501c3 affiliate to carry out the charitable part of the LEHC's mission, and maybe you can get creative about economies of scale and smart ways to use charitable money in that entity. But certainly getting a 501c3 letter for an LEHC seems to me like it shouldn't happen. I will say, like, the IRS hands out determination letters like candy these days. And so one thing to point out is, like, sometimes you'll be working in this space and say, oh, well, so-and-so does that, so it must be fine. Not a reliable indicator. The IRS gives away determination letters and later comes back and figures out that it should not have done so.
Well, most LEHCs in California are public benefit corporations. That's my experience. and some have gotten 501c3 status. One, I think, got it because it was provided services for the elderly. It was a senior housing project, and they included services as part of their program. And then I was also,
go ahead.
and I was also wondering about the issue of lessening the burdens of government.
I'll correct myself and then say, so, and in responding to LEHC, I was specifically focused on sort of as a corporate structure. If LEHC is a term used for a California nonprofit public benefit corp, then yes, that's fine. And it is the sort of traditional categories like I covered, where needy distress, providing services to the elderly is a pretty reliable way to get tax exempt status, as long as it is catered to the specific needs of the elderly. That is a charitable activity. I don't know if Eric or Jay, you want to add anything onto this one?
Yes, you're right, Jared, that most LEHCs in California are formed as nonprofit public benefit corporations, at least that I've seen, so they can get the 501c3 status. The thing you have to be aware of, like Carl was talking about, is making sure that you define the charitable class as broader than just the people that are in,
right,
that are going to be members of the cooperative. And so one thing I would recommend is, if you're wanting to see how other groups have done this, is try to look up their public applications for 501c3 status for housing cooperatives in California, and see what they've used. And you can draw on that to get some ideas.
Thank you.
Looks like Gregory has their hand up.
Oh yeah, hi. Sorry, I saw that someone had kind of answered my question in replies. I was wondering if it would be possible to hire SCLC for consult, just given the weird nature of a lot of different projects. Maybe is the best way to engage with you at first going to the legal cafe, and then seeing if moving forward is a possibility with some sort of hiring for consultation.
Gotcha. Yeah, you can come to our legal cafes, or you can email us, but we don't take on a ton of new clients, just because we work generally with our longer term clients and don't have that many clients, but yeah. Susan?
Hi, yeah, thank you. Can you talk for a minute about the for-profit social benefit corporation, in terms of using that as a vehicle to collectively buy land for people who are going to run a business on the land, but also be in community cooperatively? Like, if it makes sense we're trying to keep things as simple as possible in terms of what's on paper legally, and decide if we want to also be a kind of nonprofit housing cooperative for the people involved who live there permanently, separate from the business that's going on there, that's a for-profit, even though it's a social benefit corporation that is doing something is of benefit, and part of the mission is creating community and teaching people about collectively buying community and living together cooperatively.
Are you asking about the mutual benefit corporation?
Social benefit corporation, a B Corp?
Oh, gotcha.
That connects to another question. Maybe would it be helpful to touch on the difference between mutual benefit, public benefit, and then Delaware public benefit or B Corp? I think that might help frame it. I don't know, Eric or Jay, does that make sense, or did you want to hit a different part of that question?
Go for it.
Yeah, and someone just answered in the chat, but public benefit corporation, when used as in the phrase California nonprofit public benefit corporation, that refers to something that is a true nonprofit, could be a 501c3. It is not owned, it does not have shareholders, it is not eligible to be a B Corp or a hybrid corp. Sometimes the word public benefit corporation gets used in connection with B Corps because Delaware Public Benefit Corporation is actually a kind of entity that has a mixed, both a social mission and a shareholder-based mission. And so often when you see something that a B Corp is really just a registration you get from a nonprofit, from B Lab, as Matthew pointed out in the chat. And so you may set up a public benefit corporation to get eligibility from that, from a tax perspective, from a compliance perspective, from a ability to get donations perspective. It's just a for-profit like any other, from that perspective, in terms of the sort of different icings. You won't be able to get a 501c3 icing with that. A mutual benefit corp, which it sounded like, you know, you might be thinking about in terms of a cooperative. This is something our group is setting up to benefit us, the group, is something that could get certain kinds of tax status, but not 501c3 or 501c4 tax status. And if you wanted to make the thing you're talking about a 501c3, you have to get creative about, well, how does those activities that are happening either further a charitable educational purpose? How are we avoiding inurement? How are we maybe buying up some space and renting to local businesses at a reduced cost to preserve the community? Those are the kind of arguments I would be trying to make. I don't know, Eric or Jay, you want to add anything there?
Since we have just a few minutes left, maybe we can go to next question from Abe.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this is a very specific question, so I don't know. But if you were to have a urban income sharing commune that was in mutual aid to the larger community and had like a community hub with things like a laundromat, the parts that were had shared ownership or access with the larger community, what legal entity would make sense for those parts of the community?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand exactly what the situation is. I feel like we might need a little bit more detail. So that might be a better question for our legal cafes, if that's something that would be accessible to you.
I don't think there's a short answer to that one, other than I can imagine a business with a mutual, you know, setting up a affiliate 501c3 to do some of that stuff. But if you have true mutual aid as part of your activity, you're probably talking about two separate entities to do that work, would be my guess. But yeah, I think it's a great legal cafe question.
Yeah. How about Matthew?
Awesome. Yeah, thank you all so much for this presentation. Very helpful. I was curious about, as I kind of mentioned in the chat, you know, there's these like other types of, I don't know if there are other entity types, but like a REIT, for example, a real estate investment trust, or we've been learning from the National Coalition for Community Capital about these. It's like a DCIF, which is a, you know, diversified community investment trust. Is this something that like comes after entity formation, where you're electing to become a REIT, or and like, is there a certification body for that? Do you all know?
I don't want to monopolize. Jay or Erica, do you want to speak? My understanding of a REIT, not being a real REIT lawyer, but working with a lot of charities that invest through REITs, the REIT is more or less there's a tax classification element. It is a thing that invests in real estate in a way that generates types of income that are favorable to investors. And so it is, I think, less a matter of corporate structuring them. My guess is REITs are all structured pretty similar ways. And more about the thing you do is exclusively real estate investment. You exclusively generate these kinds of income. And if you can meet those requirements, then your investors get the favorable treatment that they want, is the short answer.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who came and asked questions, and I hope you found this helpful. And yeah, again, please feel free to come to our legal cafes if you want more specific advice. And I think that's all we have time for. So thank you.